Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you here today, and we have a large virtual crowd, I'm very glad to say. The Zoom registrations for this event set a record for the Wade Center with folks from around the country and beyond, for which we're very grateful. We welcome you to the 2021 Scholars Corner lecture on J.R.R. Tolkien titled Un-Splintering the Refracted Light, Tolkien, Mythology, and the Old Testament by Joel D. Ruark. That is co-sponsored by the Wheaton College Tolkien Society and the Marion E. Wade Center. I'm Laura Schmidt, the staff advisor for the Tolkien Society and archivist at the Wade Center, and it is my privilege to introduce our speaker today. Joel D. Ruark is a Christian biblical scholar in the service of the global church, specializing in biblical Hebrew linguistics and pedagogy, and a research fellow at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. Tolkien was actually born in South Africa, so I love that you both have that country in common. Joel's research interests center around linguistic approaches to biblical theology, with special focus on the linguistic and theological use of the concept of light in the Old Testament. He serves the Bible translation organization Unfolding Word as a biblical language specialist, developing no-cost and open licensed linguistic tools for use by Christian workers and biblical translators, especially in the developing world. Although familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien growing up, Joel did not read the full Tolkien canon until after watching the Peter Jackson film trilogy. He quickly became fascinated by the various thematic and philosophical parallels between Tolkien's work and the Old Testament. After the Bible, his favorite book is Tolkien's The Silmarillion, one of my favorite as well. And one of his lifelong aspirations is to teach a college course on Tolkien and the Old Testament. He resides in Wheaton, Illinois with his wife, Allison, who also teaches at Wheaton College, and their two children, William and Cassia. Joel is also an active member of the Wheaton College Tolkien Society, and I was impressed at his speed and desire to get involved at the start of this school year. He emailed me right away to ask about the society and how he could participate. And 5 months later, we have him giving a lecture. Our thanks to you, Joel, and your willingness to share your insights with us. I look forward to hearing your talk, and I want to encourage everyone watching to enter any questions you have at any point during the event tonight in the Q&A box in Zoom. So note that's not the chat box, there's actually a separate Q&A box to enter your questions, or on the YouTube live stream chat box, as we'll have some time to answer questions following the lecture. So without further ado, Joel, take it away.
Thank you, Laura, for that very kind introduction. As I'm sharing my screen here, let me say how honored and grateful I am to the Marion E. Wade Center and to the Wheaton College Tolkien Society for giving me this opportunity to give this talk tonight. This is a special thrill for me because this topic combines my own academic research with one of my primary hobbies. I'm not a Tolkien scholar by profession. I'm first and foremost a Hebraist, an Old Testament scholar, and a Tolkien enthusiast. Some might say a Tolkien freak, and they would be right. As Laura said, I was introduced to Tolkien by the Peter Jackson films, and then I read the books, and like many others, I found in Tolkien's secondary world a vast playground for my imagination to run wild and free. Like Tolkien, I also have a love for specific and individual words, and as Treebird would say, the stories that they tell. I'm certainly not the first to find compelling similarities between reading Tolkien and reading the Bible, most especially the experience of always finding more in the text that you somehow didn't see before. No matter how much you read, you can always go further down the rabbit hole, so to speak. True to form, tonight we will only scratch the surface. The topic of Tolkien mythology in the Old Testament could easily fill an entire course. In fact, if you go back later and watch the recording of this talk again, you will probably see more than you did the first time, just in the short snippets that we will examine today. My hope is that our time together will enhance your own reading and appreciation of the depth of beauty and insight found in J.R.R. Tolkien's stories. So let's dive right in. I'm sorry, my notes are not working right. I'm so sorry. I have to begin again. Okay. To one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. Philomathus to Misamathus, that is, myth lover to myth hater. These, oh my goodness, what is happening? I'm very sorry, everyone. This worked fine earlier. I do not know what's wrong. I think what I'm going to need to do is to restart my PowerPoint. I'm so sorry, everyone.
No problem. We're happy to wait. And just to clarify, there's some questions coming in the chat box over here. We will be recording this, and it's going to be available on our YouTube channel. So you're welcome to check that out with our live stream feed after the event. It'll be up there in perpetuity. And if you do have a question, there is actually a separate Q&A box in Zoom where you can put your questions, not the chat box. And if you're on YouTube, you can enter them into the chat feed along the side, and we will forward those over to Zoom where we can answer them over here. So thanks for those questions. If you have any other questions, just let me know. I'll try to engage with everybody to the best of my ability. How's it looking, Joel?
Okay, I'm going to try one more time. I'm so sorry, everyone. I did this many times today, and it worked fine. I do not know what's wrong now.
Someone says it's Sauron's doing, no doubt.
Okay, this is looking better now. Okay. To one who said that myths were lies and therefore worthless, even though breathed through silver. Philomathus to Misamathus, that is, myth lover to myth hater. Those introductory words to J.R.R. Tolkien's poem Mythopoeia were addressed to none other than his good friend and eventual theologian, C.S. Lewis. At first, Lewis held that because myths are not literally or historically factual, no matter how artfully told, they are lies and therefore untrue. That perspective was what prompted Tolkien to write his poem, earning Lewis the title Myth Hater. Tolkien's poem is his apologetic for the opposite point of view, that the human phenomena of story and storytelling are themselves evidence that truth is not the same as facts. Yes, facts must be true in order to be facts, but Tolkien defends the position that truth does not need to be factual in order to be true. As evidence for this claim, he puts forth various aspects of the human experience: art, language, even our interaction with the cosmos itself, into which we all are born. It seems that Lewis was convinced, seeing that he himself went on to engage in his own act of mythopoeia, or myth-making, yielding the 7 books known as the Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien's ideas are deeply philosophical, profoundly theological, and, as I hope to show this evening, thoroughly biblical. But Tolkien did not just write a fancy poem defending the truth of mythological stories. He actually created a mythology, or sub-created one, to use his own term for it. And in his own mythology, he applied these very truths that he masterfully articulated in his poem. A motherlode of ore could be mined from beneath the surface of Tolkien's mythology, but today I will limit my thoughts to the topic of light. I aim to show briefly how the biblical treatment of light in the cosmos conveys the same metaphysical realities that Tolkien explicated in his poem Mythopoeia and expressed in his expansive mythology of Middle-earth. This is not to say that Tolkien uses light in exactly the same way as the Bible, because he doesn't. But the underlying metaphysical dynamics of light, that is, the philosophy and theology of it, are very much the same. Throughout his works, Tolkien uses the motif of splintered and refracted light to express the human condition. Extending the metaphor, then, we must unsplinter this refracted light in order to seek the face of God, the one who created humankind in his image and after his likeness, the one revealed to humankind by the incarnation of his son Jesus, whom Christians call the light from light. Rest your mind on this word for a moment, unsplinter. It has such a wonderfully rich sound to it. Go ahead, as you're listening there, say the word out loud, letting the consonants linger on your tongue. Unsplinter. I have very intentionally titled my talk tonight, Unsplintering the Refracted Light. If there is a single word that I would like you to take from our time together, to let it incubate in your mind and hatch again later like an egg cracking open into the world, it would be this word, unsplinter. I begin with an excerpt of the poem Mythopoeia. You look at trees and label them just so, for trees are trees and growing is to grow. You walk the earth and tread with solemn pace one of the many minor globes of space. A star's a star, some matter in a ball, compelled to courses mathematical, amid the regimented, cold, inane, where destined atoms are each moment slain. God made the petrious rocks, the arboreal trees, Tellurian earth and stellar stars, and these homuncular men who walk upon the ground with nerves that tingle, touched by light and sound. Yet trees are not trees until so named and seen, and never were so named till those had been whose speech's involuted breath unfurled, faint echo and dim picture of the world, but neither record nor photograph, being divination, judgment, and a laugh, response of those that felt a stir within by deep monition, movements that were kin to life and death of trees, of beasts, of stars. Free captives undermining shadowy bars, digging the foreknown from experience, and panning the vein of spirit out of sense. That's the important couplet right there. Digging the foreknown from experience and panning the vein of spirit out of sense. What does Tolkien mean by this? Let us inquire of his poem to find the answer. Tolkien begins by examining some foundational items in our human cosmic framework: trees, rocks, earth, stars. He proffers the question, why do we have names for these things? Why is a tree a tree? What makes a star and not just some matter in a ball? Because God made them so, affirms Tolkien. God made the petrious rocks, the arboreal trees, Tellurian earth, and stellar stars. You should be thinking of Genesis 1 now, with its manifold "and God made" the firmament, the great lights, the beasts and cattle and other animals, humanity and everything. As does the Bible, Tolkien presumes the existence of God, the divine creator. But for Tolkien, the fact that God created these things the way they are is only half of the equation. He goes on to affirm that trees are not trees until they are so named. And now you should be thinking of Genesis 2, where the divine prerogative of naming things is handed over to the Ha'adam, the humanity which God created in his divine image, male and female. Notice how Tolkien characterizes the nature of this action of naming. He calls it a response. God creates, humans name. Creating is God's job. It's what he does as the divine creator. Naming is our job. It's what we do as the human creature. It's our response to the facts, nay, the wonders of creation that we observe. Tolkien says that we do not truly see stars at all until we see them as living silver that sudden bursts to flame like flowers beneath the ancient song of creation. Otherwise, we would not name the thing, Tolkien says. Rather, we would say it's matter in a ball. But there's more to a star than that. It's a stupid fact that a star is matter in a ball. The truth is that a star is a light of sparkling beauty. Such is the thrust of Tolkien's poem in two parts. First, his mythological point, that the captivating beauty of the stars is the truth that myths about the stars intend to convey. This kind of truth is not factual. Rather, it transcends facts, being foreknown of God and humanly known by faith. Which brings us to Tolkien's second theological point. The kind of truth that myths intend to convey is not merely a product of human imagination, but in fact is sourced in God the Creator and is revealed to humanity by the creation itself. All this is bound up in that one couplet, which Tolkien expresses using the mining metaphor of panning for gold. As humans, we dig the foreknown from experience and pan the vein of spirit out of sense. In plain words, Tolkien is saying that the cosmos is not just stuff. It means something. A tree, a rock, a star, the earth. All these things mean something to us. The physical presupposes the metaphysical, and we as humans know the metaphysical via our interaction with the physical. I suggest that this metaphysical philosophy is taken straight from the Bible. St. Paul famously wrote in his epistle to the Romans that since the creation of the cosmos, God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and divine nature. But interestingly enough, Tolkien does not appeal to St. Paul for the grounding of his mythological ideas here. As we'll see in a moment, Tolkien appeals to the Old Testament, all the way back to the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, what we in the biz call the primeval history of the Bible. The story of Noah in the Bible tells us that a rainbow is not just a rainbow, but a divine reminder of God's everlasting covenant with the cosmos. The story of Adam tells us that the human instinct to wear clothing is not really because of the weather, but because of the unseen realities of human sin and shame. And a biblical theology of creation tells us that the sun and moon, the great lights of planet Earth, are not merely sources of light, but are celestial rulers of the day and night, even as men and women are terrestrial rulers of the plants and animals. We don't have time right now for a complete exegesis of Genesis 1, but there is more going on here in the creation narrative than meets the eye. I argue that the Genesis creation story is not just speaking metaphorically about light here. Rather, I affirm that the Old Testament here reveals light as a physical token of God's omnitemporal rule over his creation, as if light is God's regent, acting in his place, ruling over both day and night. Now, watch how Tolkien develops this metaphysical connection between light and dominion, with special focus on the concept of divine wisdom. Back to the poem now. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned, his world dominion by creative act. Not his worship the great artifact. Man, subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. God is the creator, the single white, the only wise. Man is the sub-creator, the refracted light, drawing wisdom. Both God and humanity retain dominion over their respective domains. God, of course, is the ultimate ruler, capital R, enthroned in his divine glory as a single white, capital W. But humankind is also a ruler, lowercase r, a refracted light, lowercase l, splintered into many hues and endlessly combined. Tolkien positively affirms that the morally good expression of this rule is through wisdom drawn from the only wise God. Although Tolkien does not say so explicitly in the poem, he hints that the obverse of this, that is, the morally evil expression of this rule, is through subjugation and domination. To Tolkien, the world spins around the moral axis of wisdom versus control. Genesis affirms that humankind is given the divine mandate to subdue the earth, that is, the plants and the animals, not fellow humankind. Similarly, the New Testament teaches that the gospel of Christ calls humanity to self-control as a fruit of the indwelling Holy Spirit, not other control. These are the basic tenets of Tolkien's mythological and metaphysical philosophy. The basic premises of his argument that myths are not lies, but are rather attempts to touch and to tell the mysteries of transcendent wisdom. Let me say that again. Myths are not lies. Myths are human attempts to touch and to tell the mysteries of transcendent wisdom. That is Tolkien's argument. What then is Tolkien's conclusion? His poem explodes with his own version of the Beatitudes. Listen to it. Blessed are the men of Noah's race that build their little arks, though frail and poorly filled, and steer through winds contrary toward a wraith, a rumor of a harbor guessed by faith. Blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found in recorded time. It is not they who have forgot the night, or bid us flee to organized delight in lotus isles of economic bliss, for swearing souls to gain a Circe kiss, and counterfeit at that machine-produced, bogus seduction of the twice seduced. At this point, the observant reader will note the wonderful irony that Tolkien's poem presumes the Noah story as actually and historically true, while calling the Circe story the counterfeit. But continuing on. Such isles they saw afar, and ones more fair, and those that hear them yet may yet beware. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but oft to victory have turned the lyre, and kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now and dark hath been, with light of suns as yet by no man seen. Skipping ahead now. In paradise, perchance, the eye may stray from gazing upon everlasting day, to see the day illumined and renew from mirrored truth the likeness of the true. Death, despair, darkness, night. These are defeated by the illuminating light of fire and sun. By singing the songs of legend, Tolkien says, humankind catches glimpses of the everlasting day and sees from mirrored truth, lowercase t, the likeness of the true, capital T. Very briefly, let's engage in a little bit of literary criticism, bringing together snippets of the excerpts we've been reading. You've probably noticed that certain words are unnaturally capitalized in the poem. That is, words that are not proper names, nor do they begin a sentence. Let me highlight some of them for you, but they are sprinkled throughout the entire poem. If you read very closely, you'll find that these terms are comprised of contrasting pairs. Origo contrasts with artifact. Day contrasts with night. Some of these contrasts occur elsewhere in the poem, For example, wise contrasts with inane, white contrasts with shadow, death contrasts with salvation. And if you line all these up throughout the poem, you'll find that the word true does not contrast with the word false. No, indeed. The contrast is found right here. True versus fact. Oh, but it gets even better. There's only one place in the whole poem where both terms in the contrasting pair occur in one and the same line. Here it is, right here. Listen to these 3 lines again. Kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now and dark hath been, with light of suns as yet by no man seen. Tolkien's entire system of contrasts is predicated upon the metaphysics of light and darkness. Not metaphorical light and darkness, mind you, but light and darkness as we actually experience them in the physical world. It is the physical realities of light and dark that undergird all of this. It's what makes the whole ideological system work. By the way, do you see that term, legendary fire, there? Throughout all Tolkien's works, fire is the primary metaphor he uses for myths, legends, tales, stories, and songs. There are all kinds of references to this. Servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor, Gandalf wears the ring of fire, and so on and so forth. Tolkien does not appeal to the heat of fire, nor to its color, nor to its consuming properties, nor any other aspect. He appeals to the physical reality that fire produces light. The foundational point is that light is more than a metaphor here. It's a step deeper than that. Fire is the metaphor, predicated upon the metaphysics of light. Okay, enough brain work. Let's do the fun part now and see how Tolkien works out some of this metaphysical philosophy in his mythology. Now, when you read about light in the Bible, you should always be thinking primarily about the sun, sunlight, the light of the world, etc. Tolkien's mythology is a bit different when it comes to light, because originally in Valinor, the celestial light came from the 2 trees, Laurelin and Telperion. It is only after Morgoth and Ungoliant killed the trees that the Valar thought to put the gold and silver lights up in the sky, out of the reach of Morgoth, presumably. These lights became the sun and moon, of course. But colors matter in Tolkien's world. The celestial light of sun and moon is consistently described with the colors gold and silver. When you encounter the notion of white light as you read Tolkien, you should always be thinking first and foremost of the Silmarils. Notice how many of the thematic elements we've been talking about tonight are included in Tolkien's description of them. As 3 great jewels they were in form, but not until the end shall it be known of what substance they were made. Like the crystal of diamonds it appeared, and yet was more strong than adamant, so that no violence could mar it or break it within the kingdom of Arda. The inner fire of the Silmarils, Fëanor made of the blended light of the trees of Valinor, which lives in them yet, though the trees have long since withered and shine no more. Therefore, even in the darkness of the deepest treasury, the Silmarils of their own radiance shone like the stars of Varda. And yet, as they were indeed living things, they rejoiced in light and received it and gave it back in hues more marvelous than before. The Silmarils genuinely shine of their own light, yet their light is sourced from the trees. And there is no doubt about the color of the light. It's white. The light is explicitly compared to the stars, most notably the planet Venus in our own world, although that part comes much later in the story. If you've seen the planet Venus in the night sky, you know that you cannot plainly describe its light as any color other than white. The Silmarils have the unique characteristic of refracting light. That is, the crystal of which they are made catches light and reflects it back in different colors of the color spectrum. The Silmarils are apt emblems in Tolkien's legendarium for so many things, for mythology, for artistry, even for humanity itself. And we could spend all night just talking about that. But for now, it will suffice to note that the pattern fits exactly what Tolkien explains in the poem Mythopoeia. Man, subcreator, refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues. So, now that you have been properly sensitized to the notion of refracted and multicolored light in Tolkien, be on the lookout for it the next time you read through any of Tolkien's literature. Take note of the objects and places and people about which you find that kind of a description. I'll mention only a few here tonight, but there are others. And as always with Tolkien, there's a method to his madness there. One of these places occurs in The Hobbit, when Bilbo finds the Arkenstone in Smaug's lair. The Arkenstone in The Hobbit directly mirrors the Silmarils in the Silmarillion. Again, you can find numerous parallels if you know the stories well and make the effort to look for them, but we won't do that tonight. Here's the description of the Arkenstone as Bilbo sees it for the first time. It was the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain. It was tinged with a flickering sparkle of many colors at the surface, reflected and splintered from the wavering light of his torch. At last he looked down upon it and he caught his breath. The great jewel shone before his feet of its own inner light, and yet, cut and fashioned by the dwarves, who had dug it from the heart of the mountain long ago, it took all light that fell upon it and changed it into 10,000 sparks of white radiance with glints of the rainbow. Now, here is where things start to get really interesting, because the book The Hobbit is a sort of mini myth for children. In The Hobbit, most everything is called by an elemental name: the hill, the water, Lake Town, the river running, the lonely mountain, and so on. This even extends to people outside of the main ring of characters: the captain, the master, the elven king, etc. These places and people have actual names that Tolkien gave them, in which he could have used, but he didn't. I think one of his reasons for this was to draw attention to the mythological themes embedded in the story. And he left us some hints that this was his intent. Most obviously, take the two prominent men in the story, Bard and the Master. Who is a bard? A poet, usually one who recites epic tales or myths, often written in rhyme. Who is a master? Someone who exerts control over other people. But there's more to it still. In his poem Mythopoeia, who does Tolkien identify as the legend makers with their rhyme? The men of Noah's race. Now, listen to how the people respond to Bard, the grim-voiced man, after his very first spoken line in the book. Here's a snippet of the conversation, his friends speaking first. Perhaps the king under the mountain is forging gold. It's long since he went north. It's time the songs began to prove themselves again. Bard responds, which king? As like as not it is the marauding fire of the dragon, the only king under the mountain we have ever known. His friends reply, you are always foreboding gloomy things. Anything from floods to poisoned fish. Think of something cheerful. First, observe the contrasting references, both to songs and to gold here. More on that in a minute. But did you catch Tolkien's very subtle biblical allusion here? Bard has a reputation among the people of Lake Town for predicting bad news, but not just any kind of bad news. He is known first and foremost for predicting floods. And in case you missed it, Tolkien reintroduces the Bard character by name a few pages later, right before he slays the dragon. But there was still a company that held their ground among the burning houses. Their captain was Bard, grim-voiced and grim-faced, whose friends had accused him of prophesying floods and poisoned fish, though they knew his worth and courage. Opposite the legend makers of Noah's race, Tolkien contrasts those who bid us flee to lotus isles of economic bliss, that's the key term, forswearing souls to gain a Circe kiss. In contrast to bard, which means poet, the people of Lake Town call the master moneybags in chapter 14. Remember the contrast between poetry and money? Now, watch how Tolkien characterizes the master of Lake Town when he is introduced. Then the master hesitated. The Elven King was very powerful in these parts, and the master wished for no enmity with him, nor did he think much of old songs, giving his mind to trade and tolls, to cargoes and gold, to which habit he owed his position. The news had spread from the doors of the hall like fire through all the town. Some began to sing snatches of old songs concerning the return of the king under the mountain. Others took up the song, and it rolled loud and high over the lake. Coming back to the topic of light now, perhaps no scene captures these metaphysical dynamics so well as the report Gandalf gives at the Council of Elrond regarding his confrontation with Saruman. This is found in Book 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring. As we replay this condensed conversation, notice especially the way Tolkien contrasts white with color and wisdom with power. "So you have come, Gandalf," he said to me gravely, but in his eyes there seemed to be a white light, as if a cold laughter was in his heart. The words white light should be ringing loud bells in your brain at this point. Tolkien is telling us, pay attention now. "Yes, I have come," I said. "I've come for your aid, Saruman the White." And that title seemed to anger him. Now, for those who may not be well versed in Tolkien lore, Saruman was titled the White Wizard because he was regarded as the head of the order. They were the ones sent from the Valar to Middle-earth to help in the fight against Sauron. In other words, you wouldn't think that this title should anger him. As we would say in colloquial speech, something's up with Saruman. "Have you indeed Gandalf the Grey," he scoffed, "for aid? It has seldom been heard of that Gandalf the Grey sought for aid, one so cunning and so wise, wandering about the lands and concerning himself in every business, whether it belongs to him or not. What brings you now from your lurking place in the Shire?" Notice how Saruman scoffs at the so-called wisdom of Gandalf. "The Nine have come forth again," I answered. "They've crossed the river. So Radagast told me." "Radagast the Brown?" laughed Saruman, and he no longer concealed his scorn. "Radagast the fool! Yet he had just the wit to play the part that I set him. For you have come, and that was all the purpose of my message. And here you will stay, Gandalf the Grey, and rest from journeys. For I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of many colors." I looked then and saw that his robes, which had seemed white, were not so, but were woven of all colors, as if he and if he moved, they shimmered and changed hue, so that the eye was bewildered. After putting down the wisdom of Gandalf, notice the titles that Saruman now asserts for himself. Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of many colors. But wait a minute, Mr. Tolkien. Isn't this supposed to be a good thing? Man, sub-creator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues. Isn't Saruman doing exactly what Tolkien says we should be doing? The answer is no, but we don't know why yet. We'll find that out in a minute. I love Gandalf's response here. It's so great. "I liked white better," I said. Now, listen to what Saruman says next. "White, it serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed. The white page can be overwritten, and the white light can be broken." Now we come to the pivotal word in Saruman's speech. Saruman is not content to be refracted light that is splintered from the single white. No, Saruman wants to break the white light, and that's the key distinction. Refracted light is dependent on the white light, which is its source. But if white light is broken into its individual colors, these colors are no longer dependent on the source. Can you guess where Tolkien is going with this? Listen to Gandalf's response now. In which case it is no longer white, said I, and he that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom. Aside from the verbal sparring going on between the wizards here, do you see the theological point that Tolkien is making? The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise and still recalls him. But if you, O man, think that you can derive wisdom on your own, separated from the single white light from whom you are refracted, you are deceived. To use Gandalf's own words, you have left the path of wisdom. So if Saruman has indeed left the path of wisdom, what path is he now on? You need not speak to me as to one of the fools that you take for friends, said he. I have not brought you hither to be instructed by you, but to give you a choice. The elder days are gone. The middle days are passing. The younger days are beginning. The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand, the world of men, which we must rule. But we must have power to order all things as we will, for that good which only the wise can see. Here we go. Saruman Straight has gone totally off the rails now. He shows his true colors, so to speak. What he really wants is not wisdom, but power. And as the old dictum states, power corrupts. But why is this so? Why is power over other people so evil to the human condition? Tolkien answers, because even though man is disgraced, he is not dethroned. We are all little kings and queens under one creator, one Lord, one God. We are all refracted light from the single white. And while we are estranged from him, we are not broken off as Saruman would have us be. Now, guess what? This contrast between Gandalf and Saruman is only one of a series of similar character contrasts that recur throughout Tolkien's entire legendarium. Next time you read any of these books, look for similar topics and themes in the contrast between Iluvatar and Morgoth, between Beren and Luthien and Fëanor, between Bilbo and Thorin, and between Faramir and Boromir as well. And these connections are not only contrastive, but they are comparative as well. You can find parallels between the characters on the left and parallels between the characters on the right. It's super fun to look for these things and find them as you read. To bring this talk full circle back to mythology and the Bible, it is a fascinating state of affairs that the iconography and literature throughout the ancient Near East utilizes some foundational, common conceptual metaphors for light, especially the metaphor power is radiance and the metaphor wisdom is light. Some recent Old Testament scholars, including myself and Sean Zelig Astor, have argued that many, if not most, of the references to light in ancient Near Eastern texts, the Code of Hammurabi, for instance, can be explained via the conceptual metaphor, power is radiance. That is, that radiating light is a symbol for either divine or kingly power, often expressed through military force. But not so with the Bible. In my doctoral dissertation, I have argued that the Old Testament consistently avoids the power is radiance metaphor, even in places where it would seem natural to use it. Instead, the Hebrew scriptures consistently prefer the wisdom is light metaphor, conceptualizing Yahweh's divine wisdom as a light that draws near to us and guides us on our way through life, even as the pillar of fire guided the Israelite people through the Red Sea. Or, if you prefer, as Gandalf leads the fellowship through the mines of Moria with his wizard staff. I suggest to you that there is a profound theological reality here, hidden in plain sight for those who care to look for it. Left to our own devices, apart from the divine revelation of Yahweh, we create gods in our own image, power-hungry despots who live in the sky, the man upstairs. But Yahweh, the one true Lord and only wise God, is not like that. I affirm that the Bible, yes, even the Old Testament, tells the story of a God who is hidden in his power and might, but is revealed in the light of his wisdom and grace. As a Christian, I affirm that we recover this light not by breaking ourselves off from God, but by together unsplintering through the saving work of his Son Jesus and the indwelling work of his Holy Spirit. Let me leave you with this final thought, that human myths are not at odds with divine scripture, not in the final sense. Human stories are an attempt to reach back toward God, even as he has reached out to us in his grand narrative of incarnation and resurrection. At the very beginning of Tolkien's world, Iluvatar, the god character, bids the Valar to participate in the story he is writing. So also does Yahweh, the God of the Bible, invite us. Of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will. But I will sit and hearken and be glad that through you great beauty has been wakened into song. Thank you very much. Now I need to unshare my screen.
Thank you, Joel. That was wonderful. And I just want to mention that we've posted some additional links that Joel has provided in the chat. So if you are curious in checking those out, feel free to take a look. I have always loved light imagery in Tolkien's works, and the more you look for it, I think the more you find. It's just kind of a never-ending journey to see what he's got there. Same with the poem Mythopoeia. It's just so rich, and the more you sit with it, the more you see in that poem as well.
Yes.
For anyone
yes,
wondering where that poem is published, you can find it in the book Tree and Leaf, which unfortunately, it's not always in print.
There
it
it is,
depends.
right there.
Yep, there it is. But you could probably find it online too, but the published version is in the book Tree and Leaf, and I wish it were in more places. I don't know why. It's harder to find in print.
Yeah, it is hard to find.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I encourage everyone to enter questions in the Q&A box or in the YouTube chat box. We are getting some in. I have one comment here that just made me realize how much overlap there is in these different, topics you're talking about between the Wade Center authors as well. You've got Chesterton's Orthodoxy in the fourth chapter, Ethics of Elfland, where he talks about the power of the natural world and how it reflects mythology and fairy stories. Obviously, C.S. Lewis was invested in that topic too. So the more you read in our authors, the more you get these great resonances across. And of course, they were influencing one another too. So Gail Barlow mentions from Voyage of the Dawn Treader that they comment that a star may be made as a ball of fire, but that's not what it is. That's just what it's made out of. So I thought that was a fun callback too.
Yes.
Someone asked about, and I think other people might be wondering this too, if you want to comment on a little bit further. Did Tolkien's thesis that myths are not lies contribute to the conversion of Lewis to Christianity, where Lewis came to the realization that the gospel story and the resurrection of Christ are true myth? And that was really the whole focus of Tolkien writing the poem Mythopoeia. Do you want to comment that a little further, Joel?
So I myself have not done specific research into that. I have read bloggers and other people online that would suggest that this poem Mythopoeia was a key component of Lewis's conversion to Christianity, but I don't know if that's actually true or not.
Well, I can comment on that. I mean,
yes,
Lewis is part of my job.
Yes.
In a big way. So yes, Tolkien and Lewis were very good friends. They had a shared walk together in the evening with someone else named Hugo Dyson. And they were talking about myths as being true. and actually the Christian story being the one true myth. And this was a big thing for
Yes.
Lewis because he loved myths, he loved story, but he thought the material world is all there is. He was an
Yes.
atheist from youth.
Yes.
After the tragedy of his mother dying, he thought God didn't care about, him or anybody else,
Yeah.
so he must not exist. So the bringing together of myth and the fact that it could be true and that stories could have truth in them with the natural world was huge for Lewis and a big step in his conversion. It led him towards theism, and then eventually he embraced Christianity. If you want to read more about that, check out the book Surprised by Joy, which is Lewis's spiritual autobiography. But that poem that Tolkien wrote, Mythopoeia, was specifically to Lewis saying, hey, myths can have truth in them too. Because they were debating about this, this is conversation they were having.
And that was in the early 30s, as I recall. So it's like a few years before, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. And he started writing The Hobbit sometime in, I think, summer of 1930. So it might have been a little earlier than that conversation, but it was all kind of the same era for sure.
Right.
Yeah. We have a question from David Daubert. He says, how does this fact versus truth use in Tolkien contrast with the abuse of truth as allowing people to simply choose and cling to alternative facts that plagues our culture today? And what insights would Tolkien offer that can help us overcome just flat out lying and pretending it is true? That's a pertinent question, I think.
Right. So I think that the nature of the contrast that Tolkien is making is not to say that these things are opposites, or to say that that truth and facts are mutually exclusive. Like, I think his point is that truth transcends fact. So not that those things are necessarily contradictory, but that there's more to it. So so I think that's what I would say, is that the nature of, sorry, let me back up. And there are clues that Tolkien puts in that poem that lead to this conclusion that these things, that Tolkien is not envisioning these things as being opposites or they're not antitheses. Is that a word? Yeah, it's not an antithesis, right? He talks about, blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found in recorded time, right? So and time, if I remember right, like time is one of the capitalized words right there. Mm-hmm. So the nature of these two things that he's contrasting are not necessarily opposites. But yeah, so I think that's what Tolkien is getting, that truth, there's more to truth than just facts, but that doesn't mean that you can throw facts out.
Very good. Speaking
That's a great question. That's a great question.
Yeah, it absolutely is. Speaking of the capital letters, we had a question. I think this came in from YouTube. Brahmacus is the person who submitted it. I questioned the theory that the capitalized words are part of a contrasting word pair scheme. I think this was when you were talking in the Hobbit section about Bard and the words like gold and those sorts of things. I interpreted the capitalization of certain words as indicating that they represent primal concepts rather than their ordinary meanings. Not just true, but the capital T true.
Right.
Not just now, but the now, capital now, etc. Did Tolkien confirm the contrasting words theory, or is it your own?
It's my own. It's my own. He might have confirmed it at some point, but if he did, I don't know. What I would say is keep looking at those words. That's what I would say.
And capitalization can be very complicated in Tolkien. I will just put that out there.
Yes.
Whenever you're looking, how often does he capitalize the word elves versus lowercase? And, time is capitalized here, but not there. And, so part of the time I think he was like, what mood do I want to strike in this passage? And am I going to capitalize this or not? Someone else, Stephen Acree asks, could you speak to the Galadriel's vial of light? So the phial of Galadriel, Lord of the Rings, and that is of great mythic quality and goes all the way back to the Silmarils that you were talking about.
Yes, it does. Okay, so it's hard for me. I have been thinking about light for so long because it was part of my doctoral work, and so like I'm sitting here trying to think what to say and what not to say because I could talk for a long time about light. So there are a number of different things that there are a number of different parallels between the file, right, Galadriel's file, and the Silmarils. So particularly, right, like if you read very carefully in Tolkien's work about the Silmarils are very closely associated with hands, for example. So like you'll notice it, right? Like Bilbo, like when Bilbo gives it back to Gandalf, like he holds it in his hand, right? And if you know the Baron story, for example, like the hand is very important in that story. So there's this wonderful phrase of, not a wonderful phrase, just a term of holding aloft, right? Like you hold something aloft, and it's actually not found very often in Tolkien's work at all. When you find this phrase holding aloft, you find it about the Silmarils. And then you find it again about the vial, right? Like when it gets to that part in Shelob's lair, like it occurs like 3 times in the same page or something like that. Like, you know, he held aloft the vial. So there are parallels in there. And I think like Tolkien means us to be thinking, right? Like when we read about the vial and the magical properties that it has, I think we are meant to be thinking about the Silmarillion and light. And I think particularly, in my talk, I made a joke about, you know, the Valar putting the lights in the sky out of the reach of Morgoth. But Tolkien specifically says at that point in the Silmarillion, they put them in the sky because they believe that light is somehow going to hinder Morgoth's work. Right, like they put him in the sky so that it will shine on Middle Earth where Morgoth is, so that hopefully he will be, you know, kind of put down somehow. It's the same type of thing. Like there's something magical and metaphysical that's going on there, and I think we're meant to think the same thing in the file, right? Like there's something about the light that's like the light itself is fighting Shelob in some way.
Right, and if we trace this all the way back, for those maybe not as familiar with the Silmarillion, you know, you have the light of the trees that goes into the Silmarils, okay? And then one of those Silmarils becomes a star in the sky.
Yes.
And that is the Star of Arendelle, which you hear referenced in The Lord of the Rings. And then Galadriel captures that light in her mirror and then places that into her file that she gives to Frodo. And I love that passage when they're on the stairs of Cirith Ungol and they say, wow, we're part of the same story, Mr. Frodo, and that light in your glass goes all the way back, you know. So I love those connections. And speaking of lights in the sky, define Morgoth. I came across something that talked about the Valacirca. I don't know if you've ever heard of that constellation in the sky. It's meant to oppose Morgoth. Like the whole point of Elbereth putting that in the sky was to say, you're going down, you know, and this is a promise, almost like the rainbow after the flood. The Valacirca is this promise saying Morgoth will be defeated, Sauron will be defeated.
It's called the sickle of the Valar, if I remember right. Yeah. So it's like it's a weapon, right? It's doing something.
Yeah. So I love that. I love those little, you know, tidbits that you pick up that digger you deep into Tolkien. It's so fun.
Totally.
We have another question here from Michael Jahosky. He says, in my book, I talk about the dangers of subcreation as exemplified in Aule's creation of the dwarves. I thought of this as you were speaking of Saruman's desire to be the white light. Do you see these desires to subcreate independent of Iluvatar as a result of Melkor's desire to make his own music?
That's a great question. So I think that, right, sub-creating independent of Iluvatar. So when Aule is doing his thing with the dwarves, it's been a while since I've read that. I don't think it's that he's trying to do it independent of Iluvatar. I think it's that Aule is in creating free living beings, he is kind of encroaching on Iluvatar's territory, right? Like it is Iluvatar. I think
he's really excited. Like he knows the children are going to come, and he's like, "When's this going to happen? Oh, I'll make some right now."
And Iluvatar basically says, like, you're trying to do something you can't do, right? If this project were successful, all they would do is just move around like at your will. When you thought about them, they wouldn't have any free life of their own. And but I think the same thing is still true. I think actually there's a strong parallel there, right? In that the whole notion of refracted light, right? This contrast between refraction and breaking, right, is connected to this idea of dependence, right? That like in the refracted light presumes the white light is there, whereas if right, to break the light, you've gone away from the white light, right? This is what Saruman says, right? The white page can be overwritten, right? It's a beginning, but it's clear, like, right, Saruman, he doesn't want to have anything to do with the white, right? Yeah, so I think that like if you want to call it the sin, right? The sin of Aule in Saruman is similar in that it operates on the same moral system, but it's slightly different in that I don't think Aule has the same kind of rebellious attitude that Saruman seems to have.
Right. I can agree with that. And it reminds me of the magician's nephew, where there's the right time for things as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Aslan does give Diggory this apple to heal his mother, but if he had taken it himself, at the wrong time, that wouldn't have had the same outcome. So Aule was presumptuous in a certain sense because he was creating the dwarves before the children of Iluvatar had awoken.
Yes.
But in Iluvatar's mercy, he allows them to survive. But Aule wasn't trying to be rebellious in that. He
right.
was kind of not in the right season for that to happen.
Yeah, and I think Aule says that. I think if I remember right, I think Aule admits like. I think Iluvatar asks him like, were you trying to overstep your bounds here? And he's like, no. It's like I said, it's been a while since I've read that part. I don't remember the exact conversation, but I think he does admit that.
Yeah, we're coming close to time here. I want to see if we can get maybe one or two more of these questions in. Let's see. David Daubert says, so is it fair to say that Tolkien would see truth and not anti-fact as much bigger than just facts?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Right. So this is what I was trying to say this before. I don't think that in Tolkien's mind he is seeing truth and fact as opposites, but rather as truth transcending fact, so to speak. In the same way, right, like that heaven, the divine world, transcends the earthly world. Right, a similar kind of thing.
Yeah. And I want to bring up, I think this will be a good concept to end on. Carl Hostetter says, regarding the secret fire specifically, have you looked at Jonathan McIntosh's ontological thesis that it represents the Holy Spirit and refers specifically to the endowment of being, capital B, itself, to the vision of the music that Eru showed to the Valar as the sole primary creator? And those who might remember Gandalf saying he's a servant of the secret fire, and your comment about fire being very present in Tolkien's works as a metaphor. This is a nice question to think about as we end.
So what I would say is that I am extremely hesitant to, on the basis of Tolkien's own writing, I am extremely hesitant to do, to kind of go allegorical with things, to say like this equals this, right? Particularly in like Tolkien's world versus the Christian faith. Right, because so I would have to really think hard about whether I would agree that Tolkien is using like the flame imperishable as some kind of symbol for the Holy Spirit. But it seems to be right. I'm not sure about being itself, but there does seem to be something there about personhood, right? Because like right, because it would be an interesting study about to actually collate all these references to the imperishable flame in Tolkien's legendarium and see what really is predicated about it, because like at some point Tolkien says like it's with Iluvatar, right? Like Morgoth goes looking for the flame imperishable, but he can't find it because it's with Iluvatar. And yet, but then it also like he says, right, he's kindled the Valar with the flame imperishable. Yeah, so it's really vague. Anyway,
I mean, it does have a creative resonance to it. And something
yeah,
that always helps me, kind of borrowed from Lewis a little bit too, is if you let Middle Earth be Middle Earth, you can have supposals in the sense of, this suppose God were Iluvatar. How does he function within that world? But it's not a direct connection between the two. You
yeah,
don't say Iluvatar equals God, but if God were
right,
manifest as Iluvatar in the world of Middle Earth, what would that look like? Same thing with
right.
Aslan, equaling Christ.
Yes,
That's what Lewis's point was. They're not the same, but within this created world and this context, how do they function within the bounds of this sub-created world?
right.
So that always helps me when I'm trying to think about faith and Tolkien and how the
Yes.
two intermingle. It's a challenging conversation to have, but it's worth one to keep picking away at, I think. One book that I would really recommend is Pagan Saints in Middle Earth by Claudio Testi. I think that was one of the strongest works that talks about how do you read Tolkien, let it be, a story, or have these pagan, quote unquote, pagan resonances, but also bring Christianity into it. How can
Yeah.
the two coexist? So there's a lot of work out there that has been done.
Yes.
There's probably a lot more that needs to be done, but it's a fascinating conversation topic that I certainly don't get tired of. So thank you,
Yes.
Carl, for
Me
bringing that.
neither.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. It was super wonderful to have the engagement. Thank you, Joel, for your wonderful talk. And I think
Thank
the
you.
best phrase to end this is one that Tolkien Society uses a lot. It's Ellen Sila Lumen Omen Tielvo, which is a star shines on the hour of our meeting in Elvish. So blessings to everyone. Take care.
Amen.